So welcome everyone to another Women's Soaring Project event, this time honoring and celebrating both Women's History Month in March as well as Earth Day in April as we focus on highlighting women environmentalists in this year's WSP theme. This event has been made possible through the generous financial support of the Associated Students of Sierra College and MiraCosta College Foundation, endorsements from Sierra College's Gender Equity Committee and MiraCosta College's Social Justice and Equity Center, and the organizing efforts of Megan Seeley for Women's History Month and Chrissy Gilbert for Earth Week. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge and give respect to the Indigenous community and land on which our colleges stand. We would like to start with Sierra College's land acknowledgement. With respect, we acknowledge the Rockland campus of Sierra College as the traditional and unceded land of the Nishanan and Miwok peoples. The secret ravine, known in Nishanan as Hoyok, is home to an ancestral village site protected for generations by local tribal nations and their members. Sierra College commits to an ongoing relationship with the United Auburn Indian community and other local tribes, and to respect the legacy of the first peoples of this land and their future generations who are an integral part of the Sierra College community.
And now for MiraCosta College's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Payim Cowicham, the people of the West, as the traditional land caretakers of the land on which MiraCosta College is built and its surrounding traditional cultural landscapes. Today, the Payim Cowicham are known as Luiseño and are made up of 7 bands: La Jolla, Pala, Palma, Pachenga, Rincon, San Luis Rey, and Saboba. We, the MiraCosta College and community, acknowledge that we are visitors on Indigenous lands and pay our respects to the Luiseño, past, present, and emerging. We are grateful to have the opportunity to be part of this community in Luiseño territory and to honor their history, culture, and perseverance of spirit.
Well, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. I am Jane Lay-Scape. I teach sociology at Sierra College and co-founded the Women's Soaring Project with Jackie as a way to honor and celebrate women who have often been ignored and overlooked in history. Each year we select a theme under which we highlight the achievements of historical women. This year's theme is focusing on women environmentalists. So we are very fortunate to offer the powerful voice of Leah Thomas, activist and author of the Intersectional Environmentalist, with us today at this WSP online event.
Got it. I'm Jackie Lowe. I'm an art instructor at MiraCosta College, Southwestern College, and San Diego State University. I'm also a co-founder with Jane, and we are best friends and educators who created this WSP as a resource to be inspired and learn about incredible women in history. We would like to give special thanks to Juan Miguel Blanco, the Campus Life Coordinator and Advisor to the Associated Students of Sierra College, who is helping us today with the technology for today's hybrid event, which is taking place online via Zoom and in person at the brand new Sierra College board.
Leah Thomas is a celebrated environmentalist based in Los Angeles, California. Coining the term eco-communicator, she describes her style of environmental activism. Leah uses her passion for writing and creativity to explore and advocate for the critical yet often overlooked relationship between social justice and environmentalism. With this intersection in mind, Leah founded and launched the nonprofit Intersectional Environmentalist, a platform and resource hub that aims to advocate for environmental justice, provide educational resources surrounding intersectional environmentalism, and promote inclusivity and accessibility within environmental education and movements. Building on her work in the field, Leah penned The Intersectional Environmentalist: How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet. Published in March 2022, the book serves as an introduction to the intersection between environmentalism, racism, and privilege, and as an acknowledgement of the fundamental truth that we cannot save the planet without protecting all of its people.
Leah is also the founder of the Eco Lifestyle blog at Green Girl Leah, where she uses her multiple years of eco-focused educational and work experience to inform her ever-expanding list of projects and connect with her audience of more than 400,000 followers across channels. Leah has been named to several notable lists, including Time 100 Next, Insider's Climate Action 30, Marie Claire's Creators to Watch, Ebony Power 100, and InStyle's The Badass 50, and is an established public speaker who has presented at Google, 1% for the Planet Global Summit, Dreamforce, and more. Her writing has appeared in a variety of publications, including Vogue, Elle, Marie Claire, Teen Vogue, the Washington Post, and High Snobiety. Okay. She has also been featured in Harper's Bazaar, W Magazine, and CNN, as well as Good Morning America, ABC News, NBC, The Weather Channel, and numerous podcasts. Leah is a graduate of Chapman University with a BS in Environmental Science and Policy and a cluster in Comparative World Religions. She has interned with the National Park Service and has worked at leading green companies, including eco-friendly soap company, Ecos, and outdoor retailer Patagonia.
So in our conversation with Leah today, we are very excited to have the following student leaders helping moderate these questions. So we have Maya Mosley, Student Senate President, Johanna Vu, Student Senator, who authored the bill to help fund the Leah Thomas event, Juan Barkley, the environmentally concerned organization of students, Ecos Club President, and also Lindsay Landwehr, environmentally concerned organization of students club Vice President. And we also have Jacqueline Reed, sociology honors student in 2 different sociology courses that are focusing on intersectional environmentalists. We have to end.
Okay. At this time, Jane and I would like to delve into student questions for Leah before taking questions from the audience today. In the meantime, we'd like to invite the audience on Zoom to type their questions in the Q&A section and to also make comments in the chat box at any time. We love seeing the digital interaction in the chat box. And now we'd like to officially hand over the discussion to the student leaders.
All right. So for those who have not read your book, can you briefly explain what intersectional environmentalist is referring to and why it is so important?
Absolutely. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yay. I'm just so stoked to be here virtually, so thanks again for having me. And for those of you all who don't know, intersectional environmentalism is an approach to environmentalism that has environmental justice at its center. And for those of you all who don't know, just a quick rundown on what intersectional theory means in its original context. There's a court case I always use as an example that helps kind of sum it up. But back in the day, legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw was analyzing a series of court cases, and one in particular was with General Motors. And unfortunately, that General Motors office decided to fire all of the Black women specifically in the office. And they took that case to court and thought they were guaranteed to win, but the case was dismissed under the grounds that there were still Black men working at GM, so it couldn't be a case of racial discrimination, and there were still white women working at the office, so it couldn't be a case of gender-based discrimination. And essentially, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw argued that there would be loopholes in the legal system if you didn't consider overlapping identities and how those things compounded and created that specific outcome. So intersectional theory analyzes these compounding factors and things like that. So applying intersectional theory to environmentalism specifically looks at things like income, race, gender, etc., and how those compounding factors or separate factors might lead to different environmental outcomes and hazards. So I wrote the Intersectional Environmentalist book as a one-on-one textbook to teach people why it's really important to look at things like median income, gender, race, culture, etc., when thinking about environmentalism, because income and race are the number 1 and number 2 indicators of who experiences environmental hazards. So that's a little bit about what intersectional environmentalism means to me and why I wrote the textbook, mostly because when I was studying environmental science, it wasn't mandatory at the time for people to take an environmental justice class. And that's something that's changing in universities around the world, but I am a little biased and think that environmental justice is incredibly important to environmental education.
Thank you.
The organization you founded, Intersectional Environmentalist, includes a multitude of resources on topics like the global waste trade and the importance of preserving the land of Indigenous peoples. How does understanding the backgrounds and identities of Black, Indigenous people of color in particular help progress the understanding of the climate crisis?
That was such a great question. Thank you so much. I think a really important thing is, one, Indigenous peoples worldwide protect over 70% of the world's biodiversity, which is incredibly important. And yet, Indigenous communities and Black and Brown communities all over the world are facing the brunt of the climate crisis unequally. So the folks that have solutions that are nature-based solutions that are baked into their culture and know how to care for the earth aren't the folks that are being uplifted to share some of those solutions. So it's really important to consider all people when it comes to coming up with solutions to protect our planet, especially those cultures that have demonstrated the ability to care for the earth with that statistic that I mentioned earlier. And then also making sure the people who are the most impacted by the climate crisis and currently environmental injustice have a seat at the table.
Thank you for that. In your own words, how can an increase of representation encourage movement towards a better world, both culturally and environmentally?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think having diverse coalitions is incredibly important. And as I explore in my book, there's something called the 8 identity aspects. So that's things like age, race, gender, ability, sexuality, on and on. I do specifically focus on racial justice and also income inequality, but there are varying identity aspects that all of us hold, whether it's diversity of thought, diversity of race, gender, etc. And I think having a diverse coalition of people can really help us develop the most comprehensive environmental policy as possible. And it's never going to be perfect, but something that we've run into with environmental policy in the past is not considering things like race and income. So if we're looking at an environmental issue and we're only focusing on the what, so for example, okay, here's a lake that's polluted, that's the what, there's pollution in the water, but we're not asking the question who. So we're not asking, okay, are there fishermen who are impacted by the polluted water? Are there Indigenous communities that are impacted by the water? Are there local communities, farmers, etc.? We're not able to develop super comprehensive policy that's addressing all of those different communities and stakeholders. But I'm also really excited because we're currently in an environmental justice renaissance of sorts. There was just an announcement that came out of the White House, I believe, 2 or 3 days ago, where we now have an Office of Environmental Justice. And for the first time in history, we're seeing about $100 million in grants that were presented this year, specifically focusing on environmental justice. So I'm feeling really optimistic and hope some of these conversations are things of the past, because there's been such strong mobilizing for environmental justice since the 80s. And it seems like the time is now for a lot of those solutions to some of those inequities.
Thank you for that.
Hi, Leah. In your environmental activist journey, who are the most influential activists that you looked up to that encouraged you to become involved in climate activism?
Yeah, I really tried just about everything when I was in school, from being a National Park Service ranger intern to working at companies like Patagonia. And I would say one of my probably unlikely heroes as a person who knows nothing about the world of climbing. When I worked at Patagonia headquarters for about 2 years, I was an assistant to Rick Ridgway. And he is best friends with Yvonne Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia. And they're both famous rock climbers that just summited mountains around the world and decided to create a clothing brand. And while I was his assistant for about 2 years, I got to listen to him prepare to give his talks around the world. And just seeing how humble he was such an inspiration to me. and then learning about how this group of climbers that were just traveling around the world and somehow ended up with this like multi-million-dollar corporation, decided to really bake activism into the foundation of the company, and help start things like B Corporation, also really supporting, fair trade manufacturing, and redirecting funds for environmental justice and climate action. So I would say Rick was a really great mentor, just being able to examine the ways that, even corporations can be supporters of grassroots climate activism. And then other people I really look up to would be Jose Gonzalez, who founded the organization Latino Outdoors. He's been a really great supporter of the work that I'm doing, and has just really stressed the importance of intergenerational coalition building, which I want to stress today, because there's really nothing new under the sun, and there might be new terminology that comes up, but you can find that same thing like 20 years ago said and expressed in a different way. So I think some of my biggest teachers have been people much older than me and sometimes much younger than me, and just making sure that I know everyone can be, even if they're a mentor, they can be a mentee and vice versa. So those are some of the people who have really helped me in my environmental journey.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Leah. I was wondering, how did you put aside your own anxieties to proceed with speaking out against destructive practices and policies?
This is a really good question, because I also have anxiety like many people. So speaking out about things, I mean, I was really quiet growing up, and this is the last thing that I thought I would ever do. I think writing a book is perfect for shy people, because you can just go in a little research hole. But then I speak, and it's really funny because I never thought I would be doing this in a million years. And I think just remembering that it's not about me, and of course I like myself, I'm fine. But just understanding that when I'm talking, it's not necessarily about me as an individual, it's about the different communities that I'm a part of, and trying to, with the platform that I have, be a spokesperson and advocate for their needs, because there are folks who are on the ground organizing day in and day out, and they don't necessarily have the time or the visibility to speak. So when I created Intersectional Environmentalist and we're able to develop a community that reaches millions of people every year, just seeing how that visibility can direct people back to grassroots environmental justice activism and the stories of people all around the world, which feels like an incredible responsibility that I don't take lightly. So I guess when I think of that and I think about the mission and why I'm doing this work, that helps me kind of get over any anxiety that I have. And I think also I've gotten to a place in my work where I'm not necessarily here to argue, I'm here to advocate. So I used to, in the past, sometimes get into arguments with people who would be like, it's about income, it's not about race, it's about this, it's about that, the trees aren't racist, like, what are you talking about? And then just understanding that, okay, I'm here to advocate for something that I feel is not controversial, the right for everyone to have access to clean air and clean water and a safe and healthy living environment, and really just meeting people where they're at, whatever their background may be. And I think that's made me a lot more confident in my work, and just remembering I'm here to advocate, not argue, and I'm here to be a spokesperson for unheard voices.
Thank you.
In the book, you discuss how we all come from different upbringings, values, and socioeconomic backgrounds, which also ties to our different skill sets that we bring to activism. Because of these differences, some activists are comfortable in being at the forefront of protest and having their voice heard. However, you also describe that activism can show up in different ways, such as writing this book. Can you talk more about this?
Yeah, I read an article that I think everyone should read. It's called Lessons from the 60s by Audre Lorde. And essentially she's talking about the civil rights movement of the 60s. And something that she wishes a lot of people knew was there's a lot of time where people were arguing about different theories of change, instead of coalition building with other people's theories of change. And I think that's something that I express in the book, because oftentimes I hear people that are saying, we need direct action, or we need to change corporations from within, or we need to have more people in academia, etc. And it's almost kind of like an activism battle of direct action is more important than social media, or academia and research is more important than policy, and vice versa. And I think it's all important. I think showing up in any way that you can is what's going to propel this movement forward. So I have respect for people and their different theories of change, as long as it's not harming people. That's where I draw the line. But if there are people who their thing is social media activism, I don't like to entertain conversations from people that say, oh, well, that's not serious enough, or that's not doing enough. Or if someone, even if they're kayaking into the middle of the river in something called kayaktivism, which is very popular in environmental spaces, someone might say, why are they kayaking and doing art installations for the climate? I just don't get it. But I think there's room for everyone. And I think we could activate even more people if we showed them that you can be an activist by doing what you're actually really good at and what you love. And that was a piece of advice I got from a mentor of mine that said, well, every movement needs an accountant. And I started thinking about, there are folks who are just naturally really good at math or accounting, and they would never want to go anywhere near a megaphone. But there's so many grassroots environmental organizations that need an accountant, that need help with some of these behind the scenes things. So I really want to encourage people to show up as their true self and know that they are needed in the environmental movement. And that's why I wrote about the different ways that people can get involved.
Our next question is, how can learning about intersectional environmentalism apply to other majors beyond sociology and environmental sciences to include other academic disciplines?
Yeah, I mean, I think all roads lead back to the earth, not to be too hippy dippy, but it's true. So whether you're focusing on infrastructure, so important to have environmental considerations and urban planning, and I don't know, even things like planting more trees and can really help. Or even if you're engineering or doing math or whatever field it is, it all connects back to the environment. So I think it is really important for people to learn about sustainability and environmentalism, even if they aren't an environmental science and policy major. So even if we're talking about things like healthcare, we need more environmental justice advocates in the healthcare field. Because, for example, and this is a statistic from about 3 years ago, it was 71% of African Americans live in counties that frequently violate federal air quality standards. And there's a lot of other data points that I get into for my book, specifically for AAPI communities, Indigenous communities, Black and Brown communities, low-income communities, Latinx communities, etc. If you all are curious about some of those statistics. But if we have healthcare providers that understand there's higher asthma rates or respiratory illnesses in African American communities, but they're not also educated in environmental policy enforcement and understanding some of these environmental factors that are leading to some of these like health outcome inequalities, I think it's less comprehensive. So I think environmentalism should flow throughout different curriculums, because I'm biased and I love the environment, and because I think it would help activate more people to advocate for the planet.
All right, Leah, what is the biggest problem that ecofeminism attempts to combat, and how can we get everyone, including men, to be more involved in dismantling patriarchy and its negative effects on both nature and women?
That's such a great question. I wish I could like write it down and like share it on social media, because I think more people need to hear that. So thank you for asking. But ecofeminism and learning about it is what really inspired me to learn about intersectionality and how it could be applied to the environment. And for folks who don't know, so there's different types of ecofeminism, radical and cultural, and they're both a little different, and I'd recommend diving into that. But essentially it argues that if a society degrades and exploits women, that society oftentimes will also degrade and exploit the environment. So it draws a connection to, inequity that women may face in a society, and how that society might respect the earth or not respect the earth. And then it's also really interesting because there are a lot of women specifically in sustainability and working within environmental organizations. And yet sometimes if we're looking at the leadership of some big green, it's not always women, but there are more women who are working in the sustainability field. So that begs the question of sometimes why are women seen as responsible for being nurturers and restoring things back to health, including the environment, when it should be a responsibility of us all. So I think if men are wondering like, well, how can we get involved? I would say, yeah, show up. There was even a study, which I think is funny, but in the wrong ways, that a lot of men don't want to use bags, reusable bags, because they fear how it looks if they're carrying a purse. So they would rather use plastic bags because of societal norms and gender roles, and they don't want to carry bags. So even things like that, just showing up with a reusable cloth bag at the grocery store, like normalizing it amongst your friends, normalizing using reusable water bottles and things like that really does go, a long way.
Thank you.
Leah, your book was organized as a great educational resource that weaves together the history of social and environmental justice. Did you have a goal in mind while writing this book that it might be used in the classroom as an educational tool?
That was my number one goal, and I'm really excited that it's starting to be used. I thought about myself as an environmental science and policy student and kind of what I wish I had my first year, second year, because I think if I would have learned about the history of environmental justice, ecofeminism, and some of these other things, it would have been easier for me to start my environmental justice journey early. And I also just wanted different students to see themselves reflected in an environmental textbook that was really current. So there's over 25 contributors of varying ages and cultural backgrounds. There's also an international version as well that's available. And yeah, I just wanted people to see themselves reflected in a textbook because I didn't really have that. And that's something that's changing because there's so many even cooler books that are coming out that a lot of my friends are writing. And I also took a sociology class my senior year. And a lot of what I learned is in the chapter on privilege. And I wish that was something I could have learned when I started my environmental journey. So my number one goal was to write a really accessible introductory textbook that anyone who's starting their environmental journey could read. Because if you have that knowledge, then I think it flows throughout your environmental education. So if you learn really early on, okay, there are communities that are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis more than others. Even that one statement can drastically alter how you approach environmental policy, the solutions that you propose, etc. And I think can also help create a more empathetic environmental movement. Because sometimes I, as a racial justice advocate that's really focused on Black identity, etc., in the past, I've forgotten how I can show up and be an ally for other communities of color, low-income communities in the United States that are often left out of the conversation, even if they're like poor white communities in the United States. And I really want to be able to coalition build with more people and see outside of just my lane. So that was also another goal of the book.
Thank you, Leah.
In tying into that last question, in terms of your long-term professional goals, do you have any plans to become a professor? What are your future career plans?
I love guest lecturing. It's a lot of fun. I think eventually that's something that I'd love to do, but I think I need to learn even more. So I think this next year I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on different forms of media. So I actually started a climate justice concert series called Earth Sessions, trying to mobilize different communities to learn about environmental justice in a way that's fun. So we've been piloting it on college campuses and in communities across the country. We bring together grassroots environmental justice groups with also artists and musicians. and find a way to have conversations with everybody about why they care about the planet. And it's been really successful where we've had artists say, this is my favorite show in the world. And then we've had those artists, fans come walking away learning about environmental justice in a way that's really optimistic and makes them really want to get involved. So that's what I've been experimenting with over the last year. I even tabled at a Billie Eilish concert, which was so funny, trying to get people there to talk about the climate and like handing out stickers. And I just wrote an article about Coachella and the behind the scenes sustainability world. So I think my focus for the next year or so is figuring out how I can reach more audiences of people who might be interested in pop culture and getting them to see environmental justice as something that's cool, which as a nerdy person is like really hard, but music has been a really great avenue to do that. And then eventually I think I'd love to teach, because I feel like even what I'm learning on this like music and pop culture journey is all tying back to my love for environmental communications and how to communicate the urgency of the climate crisis and environmental justice issues in a way that can reach everyone and not just specifically environmental, academics. So once I learn a lot, I'd love to write about it a little bit more and see where that takes me.
I love your approach to that. Thank you very much.
So what do you think is the best way to educate young people about intersectional environmentalism?
I think the best way is being very joy focused at the start, because I think even just sharing the diverse stories of different people. So for example, George Washington Carver, as many of y'all may know, I grew up thinking like, well, he made peanut butter or did some inventions with peanut butter and something like that. And it was really cool for me growing up to learn about him, as a Black woman, and him being, a Black scientist. That really sparked my journey. But what I didn't know is you could argue that he's one of the founding fathers of regenerative agriculture. And that's just such a cool story to tell. Or even, educating kids about native plants that are in your neighborhood and sharing with them like the actual like names of the plants and their native language and things like that. So I think sharing sometimes positive stories and then also connecting them with the grassroots environmental justice organizations. So if there's a community garden in the area, if there's a project that's addressing, food insecurity and food apartheid in deserts, like getting involved in that. Planting trees and then talking to them about, did you know some trees don't have, some neighborhoods don't have enough trees. So that's why we're going to go out there and do this together so we can make sure that like the trees can purify the neighborhoods and things like that. So I think there are ways to talk about environmental justice or even just diversity within environmental curriculums without overwhelming kids, because data shows, and there's a really great study by an agency called Futera, that Gen Z, so we successfully have communicated the doom of the future to Gen Z, because I really want to make a visualization of this because it would be really fun. So it's been about 15, maybe more years since An Inconvenient Truth came out. And in that time period, Gen Zers have created a new category on how people feel about the state of our future and the climate. They no longer are identifying as climate pessimists like many millennials and older generations are. They have a new category called climate fatalism, where they feel like there is no hope for the future, which is so sad and disappointing. So we have to do something to swing the pendulum over to hope, optimism, not blind hope, not blind optimism, but showing them that our future is worth saving. So that's why I try to incorporate that into environmental learning as much as possible, getting people really connected with the people in their communities that are doing incredible work and reframing the conversation so people know there are people with the solutions right now. Here they are, and all they need is amplification, resources, and support, and not that the future is hopeless and bleak and there's nothing that we can do. So making sure you have that joy and hope and optimism.
Connecting to the conversation on hope for the future, looking forward, how do you think we can increase the focus of environmental conservation policy on the Congress floor?
I would say it's happening and I'm really excited. Yeah, I didn't even know like $100 million for environmental justice. So cool. But I think we need to provide support for grassroots environmental justice organizations who have never applied for grants before, have never received a big grant before, to show people how they can have access to those funds. And I think funding organizations like the Solutions Project that are wealth redistribution networks. So they get large grants and then they grant out to smaller organizations that might not have the capacity to apply for really large grants. So I think that's something that's really important. But it seems like the time is now, and there's kind of an environmental justice reawakening that's happening. And I'm really excited to see where it's going to take us.
Leah, there was a recent study that came out earlier this year that linked poverty and racism to weathering the body, which affects brain development, increases diseases, and age of the body. Can you talk more about environmental stressors and who they affect the most?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me try to think of some different ones. So in my book, I talk about everything from, so again, like the what, even if we're looking at something like tree coverage. And I love talking about planting trees, and so many environmentalists do, but I feel like we don't necessarily do the best job at saying why. Like it's not just because they're pretty. And in a lot of urban environments that have primarily Black and Brown communities, they are several degrees warmer, or something called urban heat islands, where they're receiving so much more heat just because of a lack of shade, because there's not enough trees, and the infrastructure and the way the city's designed is creating higher temperatures. And that's also leading to higher instances of heat stroke and things like that, and heat related illnesses. So that's just one example of why we need to ensure there's something called tree equity, that there's enough trees and green spaces in different neighborhoods, because it really impacts our livelihoods and health outcomes. And yeah, that was just one example. And there's a couple more in the book in chapter 4 that I speak on, but I'm really glad that you brought this up, because environmental racism flows through even the air that we breathe. And there are a lot of communities that are suffering through something called a pollution burden, where they're breathing in more unclean air than their community even causes. So yeah, those are just a few examples.
Thank you.
Hey, Leah. So, what is your ultimate dream for both your book and nonprofit? Where do you see those two projects evolving towards in the years to come? Maybe a documentary film, legislation, etc.
Yeah, so with the book, I'm really hoping that, and it's not even just my book, there's so many other books that I could recommend that are in the back of the book. I think I'd love to see environmental education K through 12, and then also in universities shift to really include environmental justice, and then also diverse environmental stories throughout. And I say those two things because they're different. Like environmental justice sometimes really revolves around trauma, and that is so important, but is also continuing the doom and gloom narrative that we have in the climate space. So yes, we need to educate people about environmental hazards and how that's linked to income and race and what that looks like in our community. And I think that should be interwoven into curriculums. But I also think to get more people excited about participating with environmentalism, infusing those solutions-focused, diverse stories within environmental education. And even I remember there was a story that we shared on Instagram for IE about a man in Kenya that made a pot that could basically be a refrigerator underground and address food insecurity. And it was shared like an odd amount of times, like 40,000 shares and all of these views, because people were just craving like a positive story and solution to food inequity and environmental issues like that. So I think that's something that I definitely am focusing on right now, just infusing diverse environmental stories into environmental education and environmental justice stories. I think eventually I do want to get into the world of film. I think that's something I'm dabbling with this year. We're planning on broadcasting our first Earth Sessions show that we want to do during Climate Week, that we're going to be holding at a remediated former power plant in Yonkers, New York. So we're planning the largest environmental justice educational concert series and fundraiser. So we're trying to make that happen, hopefully in September. So stay tuned for that.
I can't wait to see that when it comes out. Thanks so much, Leah.
In tying into your last question, do you have any other projects, events, plans that you would like the audience to be aware of?
I would say I have a new podcast. It's called As She Rises, and I'm guest hosting for season 3. It's an environmental justice podcast that shares stories about water along the Colorado River Basin. And we also speak to different poets. So there's a little bit of poetry throughout. We just released episode 1, and I think episode 2 comes out today. So if you're curious about stories along the Colorado River Basin, going to places like California, Arizona, etc., I'd recommend checking that out.
Thank you.
So we're kind of about that time where we're going to enter the Q&A. I just want to acknowledge that we have probably close to 75 people online and in person attending this event. So thank you so much to the attendees. We want to make sure that we give some space for all of you to ask questions to Leah. I know your experience definitely resonates with me just because I grew up very shy, quiet, even in grad school. I was probably known as the mute grad student, and I still don't know how I became a professor. So, and I think that your experience really spoke to me because with my form of activism, it shows up in different ways, in different spaces, right? Because my parents were refugees, survival was a form of activism in their own experience. So I think it's really important to highlight that. And I'm hoping that we'll learn more, and I hope that the audience will be able to read your book if they haven't done so, in terms of understanding the importance of intersectionality when it comes to activism. I'm going to bring it to all the audience members if you have any questions that you want to ask. Anybody?
I got one.
Okay.
Miss Leah Thomas, what do you see in the near future about the intersectional eco in the low-income neighborhoods with the help of the new Environment Justice in Office with the $100 million? You think it's going to go to the right places, or is it going to get dispersed, everywhere?
I think there's definitely going to be a lot of complications and lots of learning lessons because we need. So one of the big things with environmental justice specifically is that over the last probably 3 decades or so, I would say one of the largest focuses with environmental funding and philanthropy has been conservation, and then also tackling carbon in the atmosphere and different things like that. So we're at a point where less than 10% of philanthropic funding in the environmental space specifically goes towards environmental justice. And it's about 2% that goes to Black and Indigenous-led environmental organizations. And the majority of environmental funding goes to Big Green, so organizations like the Sierra Club, et cetera, that are also trying to restructure to address environmental justice. But that inequity is so large. So now we have all this funding, and we're going to need to figure out how to make sure it gets to the right communities. Because like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of organizations that have never applied for a grant before and might only have 2 people working in their office. So yeah, that's going to be an uphill battle, but I'm still really optimistic about it. And I think some issues that are going to be addressed or probably prioritized is definitely a transition to green energy. And that's impacting a lot of different communities around the country, and also raises some ethical concerns as well, like making sure green energy It's also safe for the different communities. But there's a number of different communities. So whether we're talking about kind of lower income white communities that have had a loss of coal and other industries will probably be some of the first, hopefully, communities that are also infused with funding to support green energy infrastructure. I think we're also going to see communities like Flint and a lot of Black and Brown communities that have air and water pollution plaguing their neighborhoods being some of the first recipients of this environmental justice funding, which I think is incredibly important. I think the awareness about Flint has led to more people being aware of water quality and air quality in their different communities. So I think those are two priority areas that are probably going to receive the most funding: air, water quality, and then also a transition to green energy and targeting lower income and BIPOC communities that have faced a loss of industry and seeing how we can strengthen different local economies through green energy.
Thank you, very well, appreciate it.
We'll take, I think there was a couple of questions online, so we'll try to move back and forth just to. Jackie, I don't know if you are able to take one of the questions from online.
Yeah, there's one that says, from Kathleen Taylor, please, if you could all do one impactful thing. Oh, if we could all do one impactful thing today, what would you suggest?
I would say to Google environmental justice, insert city. So sometimes when I'm joining virtually, I don't know where I am. But wherever it's where you are currently or your hometown, and just like follow them on social media, stay up to date with what they're doing, and donate if you can. I think people would be hopefully pleasantly surprised to know how many niche environmental justice organizations might exist within a 20-minute radius, addressing so many different issues, from food insecurity to toxic waste to planting more trees. So really just understanding what the environmental justice story is of the community that you're in, because it's going to look so different for different communities around the United States. So I would say get familiar with your local grassroots environmental justice organizations today, so you can say them off the top of your head, and as a next step, donating to them, volunteering with them, and just really getting connected with those folks doing good work in your community.
And then I just wanted to let you know you're in Rockland. That's where Sierra College is located primarily, but and also Jackie is in MiraCosta, at MiraCosta in San Diego. So this is one of the joys of I guess making lemonade out of lemons in terms of the pandemic, is having this online space to connect across different community colleges, which has been incredible. So I think that what you're saying about connecting locally is really important, but also having that virtual space to connect globally is a huge benefit as well. So are there any questions here in person? Okay, Becca.
You mentioned very briefly that you're an intern for the park rangers. And I read an article just this morning about how you had mentioned that there's a lot of activities that, like swimming, that a lot of people don't recognize go all the way back to slavery. What are ways that park rangers can help better support their community by being more aware of activities like that?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I think this is something that I also learned working in the outdoor industry. So spending a lot of time working at Patagonia, and there's a lot of questions where people are talking about, making sure that everyone has the opportunity to connect with the outdoors and be outside. And there's also some cultural reasons why there are different communities that might be more historically involved with certain activities, but that doesn't mean that people don't want to do those activities. So for example, learning how to swim is something that is usually like generational. So if your parents know how to swim, you're more likely to know how to swim. And specifically talking about the African American community, I believe it's over 50%. At one point, it was 70% of African Americans did not know how to swim. And the numbers are also really similar for Latino communities as well, where it's over 50% of Latino Americans don't know how to swim. And speaking specifically to the African American community, when I was working in the outdoor industry, sometimes they would say, well, we're struggling to find, we want to have Black surfers in our campaigns, but we don't know how to find them. And then I would step in and say, well, here's a group called Ebony Beach Club and Textured Waves, etc. Like, here are the people that are trying to reclaim the narrative about, being outside and swimming and surfing. So they are out there, but I think it's really important for people who are working in the outdoor industry to be aware of some of those things, because specifically with the African American community, it's one, because of trauma surrounding the ocean and the slave trade. Two, another reason a lot of African Americans don't know how to swim is because of segregation and banning folks from pools and not having access to pools. And then specifically with African Americans and being outdoors, there's a really traumatic history of not being safe in the outdoors. So even living in Missouri, when I would go camping, my relatives would be like, what are you doing? So you're going to the middle of nowhere. I want to make sure you come back. And they would say it in kind of a funny way, but I think that definitely came from somewhere, not knowing if you're going to be safe in the outdoors. So I think that's just having that cultural competency is really important, and not just summing it up to, well, this group of people might not want to do this activity, when that's so far from the case, because I know so many people who are interested in various outdoor activities, but maybe just didn't have exposure to it growing up, etc. So I think holding that in your heart is really important. And there's a documentary I did with Betty Reed Soskin, who's a 100-year-old Black park ranger that I recommend people watch. And she talks about some of her story and some of her learnings, and it was probably one of my favorite projects. But thank you so much for that question.
Jackie, is there a question
Yes.
online?
Yeah, I see that there's one more question from a guest that says, do you believe that racial diversity is more of an issue, or do you believe that income plays more of a bigger role?
This is a great question, and thank God for intersectional theory, because it identifies how those things might overlap and how they might exist separately. So both of them, depending on where you are, might play a bigger role. So for example, like I mention often, there are white communities that in the United States, whether we're talking about like mountain towns and things like that, where there's extreme poverty. And there's also a lot of environmental injustice that might look a little bit different from an urban area. So things like having fracking fluid in water, the loss of the coal industry and different things like that, that plays a really large role, like income inequality. And then we also find that in some instances, race does play a bigger role. There's a case that I talk about in my book that really sparked the environmental justice movement, where there was a middle class Black neighborhood that kept receiving a ton of toxic waste just being dumped and discarded in their neighborhood. And in that instance, race played a larger indicator or a larger factor of who was experiencing environmental injustice, because it wasn't a low-income Black community, it was a middle-class Black community. And then when we look at where toxic waste is placed in the United States, and if you look at a map of which communities were formerly redlined when that was legal, and housing discrimination, etc., there's more toxic waste in formerly redlined communities where there was housing discrimination, etc. And that wasn't income based. You also saw that in higher income Black communities, etc. So I think it's really important to look at those issues separately, and then also look at how compounding factors might play a role in present day and historically, because it's going to look different for every community.
I think we have time for one more question in person. Does anybody want to ask a question? Go ahead.
Hi, Leah. Thank you for being here. I was wondering, do you have any specific strategies to try to focus on advocating as opposed to arguing?
Yeah, I think I'm still learning every day. But to really meet people where they're at, and then just seeing that you can learn something from everyone. So even being an educator, understanding that it's a two-way conversation, that like I'm learning from you all as you're asking me these questions. Maybe you all are learning from me as well as I'm speaking. So always viewing conversations as a two-way conversation, even when you might be the one that's there to educate. But especially when you're talking to your peers, I think it's important to meet them where they're at. I've even spoken at like churches, so I'm not particularly religious, and I'm also from the Midwest and the South. So there are sometimes different beliefs about the climate crisis just because of like religious things. And I started speaking to churches because through some of their outlook, they might believe that the earth is worth protecting because they believe it's God's creation. And as a scientist who's not religious, I'm not there to argue with them about their religious belief, but I'm there to meet them at that common thread that's okay. They want to advocate for the earth. I want to advocate for the earth. They might have a different theory of change. So let me talk to them in their own language and meet them where they're at. And I think in also just drawing boundaries, like if you're in a conversation and if you're really listening, it can be easy to tell if someone wants to learn or if they want to be controversial. And if you find that there's an area where that person genuinely wants to learn and has lots of questions, being open to that. But I think there's a difference between arguing and debate. And I think sometimes just understanding your own bandwidth and if it's something that you want to do. I sometimes like to present data, facts, case studies, things like that, just to share with people just in case they don't know. But if you're presenting data and facts and they also are just like, well, I don't agree with you. Sometimes I just let people have it and just say, okay, well, maybe this won't be my place to do this. Let me go ahead and make impact elsewhere. But just, yeah, really listening to people and meeting them where they're at, and then really wisely deciding what you want to do with your bandwidth. And I think this is something for allies in the room. If that's who you are and you love to debate, like you were in debate club when you were younger, maybe that could be the way that you can participate. If you have the emotional capacity to debate with people and tell them why they should care about the climate crisis, please do it respectfully. That could be your theory of change. But I think for me, I had to be honest and just decide, I don't think that's the best use of my time.
Thank you.
So I just to finish up on that, I think the important point here is to build bridges rather than walls in terms of making those connections. And one of those ways is raising awareness and consciousness. So I should let you know, Leah, that in the same way, I think it's really important to teach our kids and the next generation about anti-racism. It's the same thing with environmentalism. So I was playing your audiobook with my children in the car. So they were asking questions. They're 8 and 6. They're able to kind of comprehend and ask those genuine questions. So I feel like it's never too early to be able to address those questions. And I also wanted to note, because since I'm a sociologist, that note about privilege, I take pride in the research on privilege, and I loved your comment so that it brings people together rather than being divisive. On page 70 of your book, it says, having privilege doesn't make you a bad person. It's what you do with it and how you acknowledge it that matters. And I think that's what's the difference between wisdom and knowledge. You can have knowledge, but wisdom is how you can use that knowledge to make the place better. So thank you so much for your words. So I just want to take this time to say thank you again to Leah for showing up in this space to answer our questions and all the incredible work you are doing in bringing greater attention to intersectionality in the environmentalist movement. And thank you to all of you, both online and in person. I didn't know if this was going to work as a hybrid event, but it did. So I'm very thankful for all of you attending this WSP event online and in person. And then it was made possible by the generous financial support of ASSC and MiraCosta College Foundation's Innovation Grant, as well as endorsements by Sierra College's Gender Equity Committee and MiraCosta College's Social Justice and Equity Center. And I also want to just make sure to again highlight the key organizers of Women History Month during March with Megan Seeley, as well as Earth Week with Chrissy Gilbert, and special thanks to Juan Miguel again. Couldn't do this tech work without your help, so your expertise, and also last but not least, the amazing student leaders across all different areas and spaces on campus for being able to make this event possible as well with your voices.
And Leah, I think you wanted to plug also your platform, correct? Or your social media, if you wanted to.
Yes, thank you so much. You can follow us online at Intersectional Environmentalist, and then also earthsessions.ie is our climate justice concert series. And we're always trying to bring those to different communities. So if music, art, and climate speaks to you, feel free to DM us, send us an email. But thanks so much for having me, and happy rest of your Earth Month, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much.